most of my time I was based at Cromford, and the driver down there was a chap named Pt2. He was, in my opinion, a keep clean fanatic. Everything as Herbert touched, it had got a cloth on. A hand cloth like this that used to be wrapped around the radiator or the reversing gear, so that he never touched anything, only a cloth. He was that clean that when a chap named Randall, I forget what his first name was, Mr. Randall, a goods agent, used to bring our money round in little tins. And Herbert would take the notes out, put them in his wallet. The change in those tins he'd drop in a bucket and wash it before he actually put it in his pocket.
I remember once shunting one day, we were really sick of it. We'd been at it for about 2 hours, there's no sign of coming to an end to it. And I remember my fireman saying to me, well, I think we'll put a stop to this. When I get you to move, I want you to move ahead. And what he did, he got off and he got the shunting pole and he got the hook end of the shunting pole and he got me to run over it with the front wheels. And it straightened the pole, it was like a dart. So when the shunter came, he wasn't Bain of Britain, as you'll probably gather in a few minutes, he got hold of the pole and he tried to hook on and he couldn't. And the fireman said, what's your problem? He said, well, what's these damn poles? He says, well, they're the new poles. You've got to get used to these new poles. Well, what's the idea of them? He said, well, the reason they're so narrow, the point's so narrow, is that you're going to have warming bags on these vehicles. Warming bags? What for? He said, well, any vehicle that's going to work at over 1,000 feet has got to have a warming bag on to save the brakes freezing onto the wheel. Well, I reckon nothing to these. He said, I'm never going to get the hang of this. So needless to say, the end product was that we shunted we finished quite early, so we all got away, and he went away complaining about the poles, which later an inspector put him wise to these and also put us wise as to, you know, what we'd said to him.
In April 1967, I was invited completely unexpectedly to ride in the last but one train from Middleton Top to Parsley Hay. The invitation came from a member of the planning department of the Derbyshire County Council, and thinking it would be a day off the treadmill, I elected to go. I enjoyed it enormously. That evening after work, instead of going home, I went back to Middleton Top, because until that day I'd never really seriously given the Cromford and High Peak Railway any special thought. But I stood there and I looked at the old engine house which had been there since 1830. I looked at the engineman's snap cabin, the dwelling house, the siding into intake quarry, the old loading dock, and I thought to myself, if we aren't careful, 130 years of history is going to disappear. It ends today.
Throughout 1997, a number of events were staged to mark the 30th anniversary of closure of the High Peak Railway. One of these was at Peak Rail, who provided two of their austerity tank engines masquerading as J94s and carrying the numbers of the two locomotives that worked the enthusiast specials on the final Sunday in 1967.
When the line was in operation, it was operated on a system known as train staff and ticket. This is a train staff, and there were four sections: Middleton Top to Hopton Top, Hopton Top to Longcliffe, Longcliffe to Friden, and Friden to Parsley Hay.
We used to get the token and we'd hand it, we'd be given it at one station and have to hand it in at the next signal box, en route, and what we would do, we would heat it up, we'd put it on the boiler and get the token handle very hot, and then when we would hand it out dubiously with rags round it, and as the signalman came to get it, he would do a lot of cursing and maybe drop the token, and other days we hadn't heated it up but we'd still put the rags round and he'd still got the idea that this was going to be hot. I mean, nowadays you'd probably get sued for something like that, but that was the type of thing we used to do. I wouldn't say to break the monotony, but it was a little bit of a joke we used to have on this particular line.
Well, my involvement with the Cromford and High Peak line came about as a result of a Mr. Welch, who belonged to the Railway School of Signalling in Manchester. And he arranged a trip in April 1963 for members of the North Staffordshire and Cheshire Traction Engine Club. We went along there early one April morning to Cromford Yard and stood on an open goods wagon while the men down on the ground wrapped the chains round the wire rope that was going to haul us up this tremendous gradient up onto the Derbyshire limestone plateau. The start was very slow, but as soon as we were actually moving, it gathered momentum quite quickly, and it was a similar sensation to actually sort of standing in a balloon and being lifted almost vertically and quietly up into these Derbyshire hills. The only sound we could hear was a light rumbling from the rails and from the wheels, and to a lesser extent from the cable passing over the sheaves between the line. When we reached the halfway point on the Sheep's Pasture incline, we saw the 3 loads of limestone coming down towards us. But the tracks broadened at this point and allowed the 2 to pass quite safely. And as we approached the top of the incline, the officer who'd accompanied us, who'd obviously rehearsed his piece for a good many times, he said, "This is the point where the more spectacular breakaways usually occur, and if one should occur this morning, we shall in all probability exceed by a handsome margin all contemporary land speed records."
The first day that I went to Sheep Pasture Bottom, there was a chap there called Tom Beeston. He says to me, "Go into the cabin, lad, there's a cup of tea for you." So I sat in the cabin and having this cup of tea, and side of the cup of tea there was some scraps of bread. So I thought, well, I don't think he expects me to eat these. And anyway, at dinner time, I learned that Tom used to come and have his breakfast, and then he used to leave so much of his breakfast, crusts off the bread and so on, and he used to go and feed the rats at dinner time. So anyway, he says, "Anyway, I'm not going to bring any more food for these rats," he says, "because they're getting very, very cheeky."
I started in the traffic department at the bottom of Sheep Pasture Incline as a taker off, and he had to go underneath the wagons to detach the chains and all the necessary equipment, and the limestone was all dripping through, all the slurry was absolutely covered in dirt and grease, and eventually an edge hunter's job at Middleton became available at Middleton Bottom as a hanger-on, and by hanger-on it meant you had to attach the wagons to the winding rope by plaiting these chains, and that was a much cleaner job because you was dealing with empties. There was no lime spillage coming all over you.
I once recall going up the incline. I'd been cleaning down here, only a youngster at the time, and going up the incline, we stopped just below the catch pit with a bit of a jerk, and all of a sudden I saw coming around the bend from the dingle was 2 wagons running away. They were coming at a tremendous speed, and the rope in the chain behind these wagons was hitting the lines. It was just like a whip. Right away into the catch pit they went, and I gradually got up from between the 2 wagons which I was on. Thankfully I hadn't been hit with any of the sleepers that were coming down. I dashed down to the bottom of the incline and rung up because a chap named Fred Warren, who was steam-rising at Sheep Pasture, used to come down on that first run. And to my great satisfaction, he'd missed it. So not only had he missed a ride down, he'd missed a certain death if he'd have been on it.
Now then, if we go back to 1965, Ted, I understand you were responsible, or held responsible, for this runaway down Sheep Pasture Incline.
Well, really, I was responsible for it. I got a chap with me that wasn't really conversant with the new idea of the fitted wagons, which they had changed. We used to call them fandanglers, actually. Well, I left my job to go and show him what to do, and assisted him to fasten this wagon on, and we fastened the wagon on properly and fastened the chain at the back, and then I let the wagon down to join my wagon. Unfortunately, I knocked it off, but I hadn't fastened my chain on, so it disappeared down the incline. I nearly beat the wagon down the incline, mind you, to make sure that nobody had been injured, because...
Well, I should think you'd had to run fairly fast.
Well, it was Friday morning, you see, and it was payday, and the Jack Smith, which is the supervisor of his station that works with, yes, he used to come to the bottom of the incline to bring the money. It wasn't the money I run after, but I run down to see, you know, that nobody had heard it.
I remember one occasion that when I was a fireman at Cromford, I landed one morning and I says to my driver, a chap named Bernard Walker, I says, "There's no steam this morning, Bernard." So I went onto the shed and the engine was dead. Goes to the cabin and the door's locked, and knocked on the door, and the cleaner says, "What's the matter?" I says, "Let us in, what the devil's going off?" He says, "You wouldn't ask that if you'd been saying with me last night I got run with a ghost." I says, "A ghost?" He says, "Yes, I was coming down sheep pasture incline," he says, "and it followed me." He says, "The chain were rattling behind," he said, "but I managed to get to the cabin first and lock myself in." So I says, "A ghost? There's no such thing as a ghost." A few minutes after, a local farmer come down, he says, "A goat of mine got free last night," he says, "chain and lot." And that's what it had been.
The line itself opened as a horsework tramway, but it seems evident that the engineer in charge, one John Leonard, was interested in steam traction and started his own experiments very soon after the line opened. We do know that in its individual existence, as before the London North Western Railway took it over, the Cromford and High Peak Railway had as many as 7 steam locomotives. Only 2 of these are illustrated these days. Both of these existed into London North Western days and were taken into the locomotive machinery department stock. Number 2 was a locomotive built by Bury and was relettered as B in departmental stock. It was a 220 locomotive when built, and as shown in this picture, it has had a tank perched on the top of the boiler, converting it to a tank locomotive. The other one that existed was built by Taylors of Newtonley Willows, later the Vulcan Foundry, was a 6-coupled locomotive, and as seen here was at that time working on the line from Llandudno Junction to Blaenau-Ffestiniog and was lettered D. After 1861, when the lease with the London North Western Railway took effect, that railway did in fact try a number of small locomotives from other places, but really the main change came when the crew goods, designed by Alexander Allen, came onto the line. These were 240 tender locomotives, and they were ideally suited for the line because they had a short coupled wheelbase. Some of these locomotives were rebuilt as tank engines, and at least 4 of these are known to have worked on the High Peak Railway, all of them having been fitted with cabs for protection of the train crew.
Well, the cleaners at Middleton Sheep Pasture and Cromford used to come on at midnight. The purpose of them coming on at midnight was to do the cleaning, which they'd carry out, and before they went for the break, the meal, they used to put the fire in, a slow fire. When it was on nights, they put a slow fire in about 3 o'clock in the morning. They go and have the meal and come back, and the driver used to come on at 7:30. They'd have about 40 or 50 pounds of steam ready for him coming on. To steam raise on a steam engine, you required a waste or a cloth with paraffin on it, sticks and coal. The first thing you did was always to look if you'd sufficient water in the boiler. That was the most essential of all, because in the boiler, if you haven't got sufficient water and you had a fire, your water was too low, there's a lead plug. It's like a brass plug with a lead inner, and the heat of the fire would melt that, and all steam would come into your firebox and putting your fire out. After checking your water level, you boxed it round with coal about the fist size. After boxing round and leaving the centre bare, the bars bare in the centre, you get a piece of waste with paraffin on it, light it, throw it into the firebox, which then you'd throw sticks onto. When the sticks got burning, you'd put small pieces of coal, shovel small pieces of coal onto the sticks. And eventually, when the damp had been opened and combustion started, steam would rise that way.
I was playing for Tommy Walker, really. He was the top man. The eldest son, Billy Bowden, had gone. He lived again the bell at Cromford, Tommy Walker did. Always came to work in pinstripe trousers and black coat. No overalls. And he looked very smart, but he didn't do anything on his ride. When they dropped on, put the fire out at night, he'd gone to catch his bush. It was your job to put it out and put it away and leave it at that. And always carried his basket with him, and that was the lord of the manor, but he was a grand bloke apart from that.
Well, one morning I can remember we came on for the train job at 8 o'clock, and the driver and myself went to prepare the engine. We'd got everything done and all oiled round and everything, and the driver went to wash his hands and he said, bring it out to the coal set, Edward. Right, oh Walter. So it was a very windy day. I made sure everything was clear and got on the footplate, and as I started off, one of the doors, the shed doors, blew too, and I brought it out on front of the buffers. And I went across to the traffic office and told the inspector, I says, have you got a firewood form, Jack, please? He says, no, we haven't got any firewood. He says, I haven't got any forms. I said, well, can you see about getting one, please, because you've got some firewood now. I've just brought one of the doors out on front of the engine.
In the 1890s, the crew goods tanks were replaced by the Webb-designed 240 tanks, which had the nickname choppers. Several of these worked over the line. 2 of them were actually roasted in the fire at Middleton shed when that caught fire in 1906. One of them, in fact, existed on the line right until 1952, having been an LNW locomotive, subsequently an LMS locomotive, number 6428, and finally a BR locomotive number 58092.
Well, the 6428 was a nice engine, and the J94, they come from Gorton, Manchester, didn't they? So, but they were a bit didgeridoo, rockabilly rock, but they're not a bad engine. But the 6428 was an even runner, nice engine, which Jack Harrison drove for years.
One London North Western Railway design that was employed on the High Peak line, on the bottom section between High Peak Junction and Cromford Goods, was the 042 tank known as a Bissell truck. The reason for its name was because of the arrangement of the carrying wheels under the cab. 3 of these locomotives are known to have worked on the line at various times in the 1930s and 1940s.
Fortunately, we landed at the top of Sheep's Pasture quite safely. The track levelled off and we were uncoupled from the cable, and a little 040 saddle tank engine took us for about a mile to the foot of the next incline, the bottom of Middleton.
When we were children, my brother and I, we used to play on the Cromford and High Peak Railway, and particularly in the Black Rocks area. At that time, there was a vast expanse of warren, fir trees, Scotch pines. In fact, it was a happy playground for us when we were children.
In 1950, we used to go camping up Black Rocks, and every morning this train used to come up from sheep pastures with empty wagons, and we used to climb into the back without anybody knowing or seeing us. Then we used to sneak out at the top at Middleton top.
My earliest memories are Frank Brown, who was the driver between Sheep Pasture and Middle Peak Junction, Middle Peak Wharf there. Frank lived in a bungalow 2 fields away from where we lived. In fact, he was our next door neighbour. Frank was a real character. He used to go down to the local pub in the village, the Miners' Standard, where he collected bottles of beer, which he kept on in the driving cab and the loco. And he was nicknamed Hellfire Brown because of his the speed along the track. He used to really open the regulator going up Killer's Branch towards Middleton.
One of the main reasons why you ran away out of Killer's Quarry down the branch, 2 quarrymen applied brakes to the brakes on the loads as you started the descent, but the quarry was awash with limestone slurry, and the wheels and the blocks picked it up, and you was in a no-win situation. You was almost bound to skid and run away, but sometimes at a speed that you could cope with.
For people who don't know the branch, it's roughly a mile long, and it's got 2 gradients with a flat piece in the middle. And as you come out of the quarry, you've got 10 wagons attached to you, which is a full train load, 10 standard wagons. It's about 190 tonne, plus the engine, which is a maximum load. You draw out of the quarry nice and steady, and the driver is looking at the quarry shunters applying the brakes to each wagon. And they'd got the brakes down as hard as they could, and then it's up to the driver then to regulate accordingly. Sometimes they peg the brakes down that heavy, the driver has to give it a bit of steam in order to get over this flat piece before going down to this second incline.
I remember one occasion when I had a relief driver, and we started the descent from Killer's Quarry, And I said to him, we're going too fast at this stage. And he manipulated the steam brake. He said, there's still plenty left in this, we're okay. And I said, well, in my opinion, there isn't. And I took up a position on the footplate where I could bail out. You couldn't bail out anywhere because there's walls in front of by the side of the engine or rock face. You had to pick a suitable spot. And there I am in the entrance of the footplate, waiting to find a suitable spot to bail out, when all of a sudden he gives me an almighty thump. He says, on your way, lad, and he followed me, and we landed up on top of one another. The fireman had already gone through the other side. When we got to the bottom of the branch, it was my duty to reverse the trap points and lock them up, and as I looked up the track, it was all zigzaggy. We knocked it all out of gauge. So when we got to Steeple House, where private properties run alongside the track, and people could see the three of us through their kitchen windows and gardens, they could see the three of us, and the driver said, be as casual as you can. Try not to look like three railway chaps that's looking for a runaway train. And we found the engine round by Black Rocks.
During about 1955, we used to have roughly 10 wagons per day out of the quarry. 5 of them used to go to Bow in London, and it was limestone dust, and this used to go for the asphalt blocks. And we also used to get some for upper wagons, and they used to go for glass making. They used to go to Arlo in Middlesex. But during what we call the sugar beet season, starting about September to February, we used to have the sugar stone, and that used to go to Cantley, South Lynn, Newark, Abbey and West Dereham. And we used to have about 12 or 15 wagons and that per day.
From the early 1930s, the North London 060 tanks were allocated to the line. These were powerful short wheelbase locomotives, quite capable of all the duties demanded of them. 2 of these were allocated to Middleton Top and 1 to Cromford Wharf. They lasted on the line until the mid-1950s. One of these locomotives is now preserved on the Bluebell Railway in Sussex. The piece alongside the Cromford Canal also saw a number of other small locomotives. When the chopper was withdrawn in 1952, it was replaced with a Kitson 040 saddle tank, number 47000. This locomotive had its moment of fame in 1955 when it ran through a siding, ran off the end of the siding and was upended in the garden of the station house at Steeple House. This mishap occurred due to the fact that the permanent way trolley, which was normally stabled on this particular siding, had been taken out to be used on the line, and when it was taken out, the points were not reset, so that the locomotive came trundling along expecting to go to the foot of the Middleton incline, and all of a sudden the engine crew found themselves making a very sharp left turn and only just had time to apply the brake and bail out before the locomotive disappeared down the bank into the garden.
The woman in the air thought the Russians had landed or something with a bang. Mrs. Swift weren't it at that time?
During the early 60s, when the Cromford and High Peak line was past its best, we used to close High Peak down on a Saturday. Well, one particular Saturday I was in the garden, and at that time we lived next door to the police sergeant at Worksworth, a chap named Ted Parker. And he leaned over the fence, he says, "Are you having day off?" I said, "You know damn well we always have day off on a Saturday, we don't work Saturdays in summer." Well, he says, "Engine's just going up bridge." I says, "I pull over like." He says, "It's just gone over the bridge. Jump in car and I'll show you." So up we went and got to Steeplehouse Arch, and the engine was just coming over from Middleton. A couple, 2 or 3 kids on it. So anyway, we went as far as we could get to sheep pasture, which was Black Rocks with a car. And we ran on after the engine. Time as we got to sheep pasture top, the engine had come to a stand, and these 3 kids had gone running up into the rocks. Well, me and Ted weren't following those. Anyway, the engine was blowing off. There was a full box full of fire on. Took me quite a while to shovel it out, but I was able to get the injectors on and save the boiler. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Jack Smith, the traffic inspector at that side, "Well, where did he get the stuff from?" Well, I says, "You know, Jack," I says, "I always used to put a bag of sticks on top of the boiler, a piece of waste, box the firebox round, after I'd finished in the afternoon, so that when I come in the morning, if I was late, I could get cracking in good time." And I says, in this particular case, I says, they'd use the sticks and that on. Well, he says, "That's a daft thing." No, I says, "I know it is." I says, "In respect," I said, "but I've done it like that for years." So anyway, Jack said, "Well, why didn't you lock the firebox up?" So we put a chain around the 2 bars of the firebox and a big padlock on it. He says, "That'll stop them." So anyway, that was that. Monday morning, when I went to get steam up, I landed at sheep pasture, went into the shed, jumped onto the engine. I thought, so, damn me, I've come without key. I'd left the key at home as I locked the firebox up with. And we lived down Derby Road at that time, and I used to walk it. Well, I couldn't go back there because it was quite a long walk, about 3/4 of an hour. So I went into the engine house and got a hacksaw and cut the chain, and we got it that way.
There were some curves in sheep's pasture, but Middleton was dead straight from bottom to top. Well, if anything, this seemed even steeper and longer. The impression of it is something that's better perhaps imagined than described. From Middleton top, the line levelled off again, and we were picked up by a slightly larger 060 tank engine, which took us along the level through Hopton Tunnel, and that was where we faced the climb up what is, or was, the steepest length of railway gradient that was worked by Adesian locomotives in the British Isles. We tackled it quite successfully on that particular occasion because we'd only 2 wagons with the members of the Traction Engine Club in.
The first time I ever went and visited the line, as it were, in its proper working days was, I think, in about September 1965. And I'd cycled up 25 miles from Long Eaton, where I used to live, to try and take photographs of the train going up the incline. So I arrived at Hopton, not really knowing where the train was, and I could hear these train noises in the distance, you know, clink of buffers and the snatch of couplings and the hiss of steam. So I thought, well, rather than try and waste time and effort trying to find the train, I'll sit down and wait for it to come to me. So then I sat at the sort of near the top of Hopton incline, dripping wet because of the fog, and it was almost dark. And after a while, I could hear this, what I thought was an explosion in one of the quarries, a sort of long boom, like that. And then there was another one very quickly afterwards, and then another one. And it was quite a few seconds before I realised that what I was listening to was the train coming up the incline. And I was completely transfixed by this. I didn't attempt to take any pictures of it the first time round. And the sight of this front end of this J94 looming out of the mist so slowly, to the accompaniment of all this awesome, almost frightening noise. It's one of these things that lives in your mind forever.
Well, you had to take a run at it, didn't you? You didn't take that far was your limit then, weren't you? And you go like the clappers on there, got to wait till you got round that last curve out of the tunnel and hope you got to the top. Not every time did you get to the top, you run back to the bottom. And come back this end of the tunnel and have another go. And each day were different. Some days rail had got to do with it, wet rail and all that adhesion. You couldn't always guarantee you're going to get up. But it was a work of practice, weren't it? You did it and learned by experience.
I've seen locomotives sort of thrashed to the limit in various places before and since then, but I've never seen anything quite like that. And how it was that all that effort wasn't unleashed into uncontrollable slipping, I just don't understand even now. The Cromford and High Peak was only a rural backwater of a railway, but I think its enginemen were certainly very skilled indeed. They got enginemanship of a very high order indeed.
If we say we've got 3 trips, you know, 9 loads, we should push them back towards the intact tunnel, pick 3 up, build a nice you know, a nice fire, and as you say, it was a technique. It's hard to explain really, but I mean, speed with the North Londons, that was the main thing really. You had to really give it across the bank to really get up. With the J94s, you could depend on the strength of the engine to pull you out sometimes. But speed mostly was the way you got up.
My saddest memory of the High Peak line must be in October 1937, when we didn't get a shunt at all, and word came up from the bottom of the incline that the engine had left the rails and taken with it a number of trucks. Later in the day, I went down myself and I could see that there had been a huge disaster there. Police were controlling the road, the works with Brassington Road, and sending you over the walls into the fields to get you around the obstruction. There was a terrible distribution of limestone, coal and other materials what had gone over, and these trucks were hanging precariously over the embankment. It was some considerable time before they ever got the line working again. When they did, of course, our energies were taken again to the sidings. It reminds that the death of the driver was also a blow, because he was a friend of my father's, Mr. Bowden, the engine driver of Cromford.
In the mid-1950s, the North London locomotives were getting badly worn and a replacement was sought. In the end, this turned out to be the J94 class from the eastern region, which were originally built for the War Department as austerity 060 tanks. These again were a powerful short wheelbase engine which was ideally suited to the work on the Cromford and High Peak Railway, and in fact they saw out the operation of the line until closure in 1967. Over the years, photographers recorded the comings and goings of locomotives, but one locomotive that came onto the line in February 1956 did miss being captured on film. This was a trial when they were searching for replacements for the North London engines, and they tried LMS dock tank number 47164 over the line.
The weather in summer, of course, it was a wonderful job because during your lunch break you could go out onto the pastures, the Carsington pastures opposite the line, and there were, larks would be singing, there'd be plenty of rabbits around, and you'd sit on the wall looking across as far as the Wrekin in Shropshire, you see, and the Welsh borders almost on a very clear day. And this was one of the perks of the job, that you look forward to just getting out of the plant and moving over into the pastures and looking out.
Never went short of mushrooming or blackberries. And George Repton never went short of rabbits. He was a bit of a poacher, you know, George had. He had at one time a ferret that used to follow him around like a dog. They used to call it Gobles, for the simple reason he put it down a rabbit hole one day and the first thing that came out was the ferret and the rabbits following him.
The winters were horrific, really, for weather. Owing to this open plateau, there was no shelter from wind, and combined with this, you had the late shunts, which added also to the breaks in the production line. The plant that we were running at the sidings had to be kept running to the maximum of time. So to avoid closing it down, of course, all hands had to go down and sheet up and label wagons that were going out. To avoid the delay in doing this, the overseer used to send me out, being the youngest lad, and he'd send me to the road adjacent to the Upton top. And there my job was to look down and see through this mist and fog, usually in November or early December, and see if I could see anything of this shunt, you see, it had been delayed. I'd be there for probably 20 minutes and peering through the gloom, and then all of a sudden, right across the valley, I could hear an engine coming with a good head of steam, and I knew then that things were moving, so I'd nip back to the sidings and tell the overseer that it would be at least another half hour before he was there, and it would carry on producing the silica sands and ganisters that we were working on, and possibly to avoid the delay, the plant kept working up to the time out of the mist came this shunt, you see. Joby Spencer was the shunter at the time, and he was a man, very sinuous, thin, tall bloke, coming along, rattling his shunting pole hook agitatedly along the wagons. Come on, get these ready and everything, but with no delay because we'd had plenty of time to prepare them. The hookup eventually looked very simple to my eyes, but he had done it for years, and it looked with such ease that within about 15 minutes the whole thing was moving out towards Harbour Rocks, which was Swan and Ratcliffe's sidings then, who were making firebricks. But the whole operation was over in a very short time.
Weather conditions were atrocious up here. Because remembering back some years ago, you used to bring empties back, drag them back from there, and the trap points at the top was held by the guard, and then it was that rough we used to tie him up to a post while he held the trap points while we came through, and then he had to walk down to catch us. George Pierce, he'd been a queue entertainer in London, a comical bloke in himself, but we tied him to a post so he didn't blow away. It was very rough, I'll tell you.
Oh, it was hopeless up there without a windbreak on the footplate. We used to work in overcoat and winter through. No, 1947 was the worst winter. You can just imagine the cuttings were absolutely full. You used to start at the top and dig down and throw it out, and then you left a shelf there to throw the next up. We were taking it out in 4 lifts, and it was all being thrown out over the top.
And my memory goes back some years when I'm sitting in this guard's van now. As you can see, it'll hold about 9 with a seat. My mind goes back to the 1947 winter, when there was about 24 or 5 high peak men snow cutting at Middleton Top, with about 50 German prisoners of war during the great blizzard of 1947, that very bad winter. And we used to mash our tea on this little stove, and as you can tell from the room that was here, there used to be 4 sittings when it came to snap time of high peak men. And what I remember most about it was a chap named Ron Goodall, who had been a prisoner of war for 4 years with Japanese. He couldn't understand why we had to have our snap in relays of 4 or 5, as bread and cheese and probably an onion if we were lucky. And the German prisoners of war were taken down to the British restaurant at Worksworth, where they were provided daily with a hot meal. And Ron couldn't understand it, and the rest of us couldn't. And it just brings memories back of that winter 50 years ago.
And Dennis Valance and myself, we went snow cutting along with the plate layers and everything. And it was just up above Longcliffe, a cutting that we called the hard cutting. And it was packed solid with snow, right from the top to the bottom. There was actually 27 foot of snow in that cutting that year. And Dennis Valance and myself started cutting from the top. We had to throw it out in 4 lifts, there was that much snow. And we must have been about halfway down, and Dennis spade hit metal. And we're not down to rail level yet, he said, Edward. I'm sure we're not. When we cleared it, what he'd struck, it was a cap on the top of a telephone post. And we just got down to telephone post height. That's the kind of snow that we used to have to deal with.
It was terrible. The line was closed, or it was closed for weeks.
We've now arrived at Fryden. Fryden Brickworks in the background there. Now this is the point of the railway where we had a division really. Everything that came from the Buxton side were 3-shift railwaymen, 24-hour railwaymen, whereas coming from the other way was from Middleton. They were just day railwaymen, you might say. Their shifts only lasted during the daytime. And at this point we would change over. The trains would change over. We would be taken over. The trains to carry on would be taken over by the Middleton men, and the Buxton men would then take their traffic forward. And at points we had the engines come here from the Middleton line who would go into Buxton for washouts. Now that was a great divide then. They were going to lose their engine for a day. It was going to go in and then come back the following day. So we had the changeover. Now when I say changeover, it was a complete changeover, because all the fire irons, the prickers, the darts, the rakes, they would take everything off, because they knew very well that if they had a nice shaped dart, straight dart, when it got to Buxton, it would be swapped over for one that was like an S-hook, would come back. So they were very careful on that. They even went to the extent of changing over the buckets with all the spanners, because they could come back short of a spanner or whatever. So they were very careful. They got us weighed up on that.
Well, this particular day, we've got to go through to Parsley A because we've got a change engine. We were bringing another engine back. The one that we'd got was going in for shopping. And when we got to Parsley A, the Buxton men were standing inside at Parsley A waiting for us. And it was quite a big thing, you know, to take the boards off and the sheets down and everything and move them across from one engine to another. And because we used to get quite a few comments from the Buxton men. And they said, what do you want all this rubbish for, you know? We thought you were all hard buggers up High Peak. And I'd got a driver from Roseley with me that particular day, George Repton. And he's got an answer for everything. And his answer was straight away, we are all hard buggers up High Peak, but we're not silly buggers as well.
I'm the boiler smith, and actually I was stationed at Roseley Shed, and we used to maintain the engines at the High Peak Railway, and occasionally you used to have to go up to see that we're all right, you see, anything leaking or anything like that, you see. And apart from that, we used to go over a period of boiler washing. The engines used to be washed out every so many weeks to remove the accumulation of dirt and stuff in the area, in the water spaces. See, otherwise the firebox would get overheated, and it used to show on the copper firebox on the metal, you see. The boiler firebox inside is composed of hundreds of what they call copper stays that run between the firebox and the shell, the metal shell. You see, well, sometimes I used to have a special little hammer that I used to tap them with, tap each one, go all around the firebox, and you got a certain sound off one, you knew it was broke. Well, that had to be replaced, you see. Sometimes you get probably a batch of about 3 or 4 broke. Well, that weakened that area of the firebox, you see. If there was anything particularly a big job, something to the actual motions, anything like that of the engine, it used to have to be brought down into the shed at Roseley, you see, because they haven't got the facilities at the top, in the shed at the top. See, there was no automatic machine or anything like that. It was all done by hand, you see.
Since we made part 1 of the video, the celebrations to mark the 30th anniversary of the closure of the High Peak Railway have taken place, and in the course of those celebrations a trip was arranged through the full length of the line from Whaley Bridge to Cromford. In the course of that journey, someone spotted this old milepost, and we examined it, and it turns out to be one of the original mileposts that were used to mark out the length of the line between Cromford and Whaley Bridge. This one is number 13, being 13 miles from Cromford.
We're not far away from Herdlow Station. Now, we used to work trains here. We had class 3s, class 4s, super Ds, which was quite heavy gradients, which were ideal for this line. And I remember coming over here many, many times. I remember one incident at this particular point. We were going to Fryden Brickworks, and we were coming down the line here, approaching Herdlow Station, and the driver I had was a chap called Roy Boren. Now, Roy was a real good leg puller. I mean, he could really pull people's legs. And at this point, there was people working on the bank up there. They were erecting telegraph poles. And Roy says, I think we'll have a bit of a joke here. So with this, he whistled and stopped the engine, stopped the train. And the men up the field wondered what was wrong. They came running down the field. What's the problem, driver? And Roy looked out to them, and they were all gathering in a little group there, wondering if they could help. Roy was saying, now, is there a place round here called Fryden Brickworks? Now, immediately they go in a huddle, and you've always got one that'll know everything. And one guy stepped forward, he said, oh yes. He said, well, are we on the right road? He said, oh yes, you're on the right road. Now, you're going to go through a place in a moment, he says, called Herdlow. Where's that? Well, by that time I was doubled up on the other side of the footplate, because I knew what was coming. Herdlow, right, okay. So it says, and then you'll carry on a couple of miles, and you'll come to another place called Parsley Hay. Well, Roy's milking the story. Where? Parsley Hay. Right, I think we've got that. Herdlow, Parsley Hay. What happens then? Well, you must go left. When you get to Parsley Hay, you must. If you don't, you're going to end up in Ashbourne. Oh, we don't want Ashbourne. We want Fryden Brickworks. So, okay, we have these instructions to go to Fryden Brickworks. So away we went. By this time, I'd recovered. And when we came back about 6 hours later in the afternoon, the chaps were still working on probably on the same pole. Up the field, there they are. Roy whistles to them, and one chap, the one who'd been giving all the, telling us where we were going to go, he came rushing down the field. Did you find it all right? Roy, thank you very much. It's a good job you were there. We could have been lost. We could have been out all day. Oh, we always try to do our best, and that was the sort of thing that happened on this line.
Also, since the first video, this chair has come to light, which has 3 spike holes, the centre one of which is square and which has this distinctive base shape. This shape fits exactly with the limestone block sleeper which we found at Herdlow Top. Another feature was the turning triangle at Brylow Grange. This was filmed on a very blustery autumn day with weather typical of the higher parts of the High Peak line. The purpose of this triangle seems to have been to turn wagons end for end. Early wagons would probably have had an opening door at one end, and when coming up the inclines from, say, Whaley Bridge Incline, these doors would have been arranged to be uphill to avoid the load bursting the doors open. When the train got to Brylow, then it would run round one leg of the triangle into the head shunt. The horses would be moved from one end to the other, and then it would proceed so that when it was going down the gradients into the Derwent Valley to the Cromford Canal, the opening doors would again be on the uphill end of the wagons and hence would avoid any damage by a moving load.
On occasions I did go on the footplate because thieves were coming out from Manchester and other places to steal the brass boxes from the wagons, you see, to take them away for scrap. We had several derailments, children putting obstacles in the points and derailing the train. Of course, they were suitably dealt with through the school and through the parents. I had a close contact with Mr. Wild, who was station master at Hindlow.
There's quite a few things happened at Hindlow. I could relate one story at Hindlow, which was to do with the free-falling station master, I call it. We had a station master come, and he'd previously been at Cheadle Heath, which was a busy line, main line, and he came out to the branch line here. And I remember above here is a sidings called Briggs Sidings. When we went to Briggs Sidings, he was up there one day and he got into the brake van of the train that was going to Buxton and asked the guard to drop him off here at Hindlow. Unfortunately, the guard explained to him that, well, we don't actually stop at Hindlow, we're right away to Buxton. The signals will be off and we'll be straight into Buxton. To which the station master said, well, it will be no problem whatsoever because I can get off anything at 30 miles an hour. Well, by the time they got here on the site of where the old platform used to be, they were actually doing 31 miles an hour, so it caused a little bit of a problem in that he decided to alight out of the brake, and the platform was a wooden platform and it had a nice layer of green wet moss, and at the time that he was stepping off the brake van onto the platform, the porter, a chap called Dennis Storer, came out and he related the incident to us, what happened. He said as soon as his feet touched the platform, he bounced along right to end and then rolled off. He says, now, I don't like admitting this, but I'm afraid I should have had to laugh if he'd have died. Anyway, the outcome of that was we did try in the few after this incident to give this chap lifts, and he would never ever got in a brake van again. That was the end of his free-falling days as a station master.
Diesels didn't feature very greatly on the High Peak Railway. A trial was made with a 350 horsepower shunter, number 12006, but it proved to be entirely unsatisfactory. In fact, the locomotive had considerable difficulty propelling a brake van and lifting its own weight up the Hopton incline at the end of the trials, so that we did not see any replacements of that nature. However, between Sheep Pasture Top and Middleton Bottom and Cromford Wharf and High Peak Junction, diesels were employed in the form of the Class 03 060s. Several of these were used at various times, and one of them was 2383, which worked on the upper section and was also used, of course, going up the Killers branch to the Middleton mine. On the 21st of April 1967, which was the last day of service operation, I was able to arrange a trip from Middleton to Parsley Hay for a number of railway colleagues. We had the regular train crew, Sam Buckley, Dennis Vallance and Arthur Millward, and we had a very pleasant trip to Parsley Hay, where we were met by an inspector and two drivers from Buxton. The regular train crew were made redundant on this day, and the purpose of these Buxton men meeting us was so that they could come and learn the route, ready for working a number of enthusiast specials 9 days later.
Well, I was a 24-year-old past fireman who had just been passed out for driving, and they wanted me to road learn the Cromford and High Peak from Fryden Brickworks in 4 days, which I thought was a very well, a rum thing to expect me to do.
Well, I was prompted and asked if I'd like to do it with the water, taking the water tenders to Middleton Top first. We had a preliminary runs like road learning, and I signed the road, and this final day came up and we was asked to do it. Oh, it was over the moon really, because it was one of the old railways, wasn't it? And I was one of the 4 to be asked drivers. Out of about 150 drivers, I was picked one of the 4 to do it. I'd never been to Middleton Top in my life up till 6 months before that day.
On the 30th of April 1967, which was a Sunday, there were 4 enthusiast specials organised to run over the High Peak line. The first of these was run with a set of 6 brake vans which were brought from Buxton, and even those arrived at Middleton somewhat late. The first trip up Hopton Incline became a failure because the train failed to reach the top and had to be set back to the bottom, where they divided it in 2, took 3 vans to the top, put them on the siding and came back for the second 3, took those to the top and then proceeded forward to Parsley Hay. At that point, they decided to leave 2 vans behind and came back to Middleton with 4 vans for the second trip. On the second trip, once again, failure occurred on Hopton and the train stalled part way up the bank.
And the staff at that time made the decision that perhaps the easiest way to get out of this predicament was to screw the brakes down on the two of the brake vans, uncouple them and leave them there on this incline, take the leading brake vans up, and then put those into a siding, bring the engine down again and couple up to the two that had remained there. All of which took place without a lot of, without any trouble at all, and really reflected a great deal on the skill of the engine drivers at that time, who could bring a 56-ton locomotive down a gradient of 1 in 14, stop it to within an inch of the buffers and couple the chain on without any unfortunate occurrences taking place.
And on this occasion, they only went as far as Fryden to turn round in an attempt to save a little bit of time. By the time the third trip started, Sam Buckley and Dennis Vallance, who had been watching the proceedings, had made themselves known to the inspector, and they were invited on the footplate to advise the Buxton men how things should be done. And on this occasion, with their expertise available, a clean climb was made to the top of the incline.
They talked me into getting on the footplate with them. The Buxton men, mainline men, they didn't understand the working of the engine. It was hopeless to get up an incline if you've got a boiler full of water to start with. You've got the engine in that position, you've got all your water flows back in the boiler. Consequently, you've got saturated steel to work on, just throwing it out of the safety valve. Anyway, we started off with Buxton fireman. He put the injector on immediately. We left Middleton. My son knocked it off again. He looked at the rest of his driver to say, oh, what the devil's he doing, sort of thing, naturally. Anyway, we explained to them the position, and I was on the pilot engine. The Buxton man on the train engine, he'd seen me open the regulator, and he did the same, and consequently, it was in a spin. The Buxton driver with me, he immediately was jumping across to close the regulator. I told him, I said, we're all right, we're not spinning, it's him. We'll pull him out of his wet patch and we'll be all right. I don't know about pulling him out of his wet patch. He was still priming the whole of the way anyway. As you saw, we managed to get up.
It was quite a day actually, because when we looked out, when we were going up the incline, I couldn't see the grass and I couldn't see the trees. There were that many people. I was on the afternoon turn, and there were so many people that the grass was obliterated.
Well, when we went back to Buxton, I thought we'd done a blooming good job, but it was a relief that it was all over, and I was glad to get home that Sunday night.
And my chief regret is the fact that these men who'd worked on it all their life weren't allowed to work that trade.
I was 5 days short of 48 years. When I got my redundancy pay, it was 47 complete years. And they'd left us to work that special. I should have got the 48.